on accessible technology for mobile devices. I don't know if some of you can hear that sound. It's rather high-pitched, high frequency. It's not really supposed to be heard by most of you, though. I think the hearing range cuts off at 18, so technically everybody in this room has a slight disability. And I'm sure most of you probably can't read this slide right here, so let me just move on to a little bit cleaner. So that last slide actually demonstrated a visual disability where people see spots all over their field of vision. They're in a constant space, but as you can see, it makes it rather difficult to obtain the information you want to get, such as, in this case, the name of the presentation, my name, which is Mike Oren, for those of you who don't know, and all that other stuff. So moving on, I'm going to be giving you general information about disabilities, mostly just the ones that are affected by the new digital age. Either they're becoming more at a disadvantage because of the technology, or they're being given greater opportunities due to more accessible technology. And I'll be going on to the digital divide and then talking about the accessibility framework that all of you should have read. And then I'll be talking about building an accessible iPod, which I hope all of you will participate in. So, defining disabilities. I'm going to use these slides just for your reference, just look at them, but I'm just going to give you a general overview. Disabilities basically are things that you either have issues with your senses, like seeing, hearing, tasting. Tasting isn't really affected by technology at this moment, although the military is actually working on ways of controlling interfaces using your tongue, so then it might actually be affected. But right now it's fine. And then there are also people who are immobilized, so they can't feel and they can't move around as much. And there are 32 million disabled people in the United States as of the 2004 census. So the types of disabilities I'll be going into are the ones that are primarily affected by technology. Visual impairment is pretty big. A lot of the information we're obtaining now from technology is all visual, whether they're web pages. Flash is especially bad for visual impairment people because it's all visual, not so much text, and most people don't have any labels or anything to describe the flash. Then there's the hearing impairment. That's primarily affected by the abundance of cell phone. As I mentioned in our Tuesday discussion, a cell phone can have issues for colloquial implants. Also, paralysis, people who are paralyzed are affected, both by enabling technology, such as technology that allows them to talk, like such as Stephen Hawking, how he has that little computer he brings around with him to talk with, and by technologies being less accessible, such as computers, because they can't exactly use a mouse or keyboard as well. And then people with mental disabilities, those include things like Alzheimer's disease, which is pretty common. I don't know how many people in this room know people that have even a minor disability. Can anybody want to give any examples? Derek? Oh, okay. Okay. Okay.
Macular degeneration.
Okay, and so I'm sure you all understand how these how technology affects them and makes it difficult for them to go through modern life, so to speak. So I'm going to start out with visual impairment. I split this out into 4 major areas. There's the partially sighted people. Those are people who have usable vision. They can still see text and everything and make it out. I mean, they might have to enlarge text, or they might have to move their head if they've got those splotches within their vision. But they're still, I mean, it's usable enough that they can still get around for the most part. Low vision is fairly similar to that, but it's a little bit more severe. So they'd have to raise the size of font a lot more. This can be extremely problematic if your software application doesn't allow the font to be changed, or if you're using a mobile device where even the largest size is often fairly small. And then there's the legally blind, and these are people who often have severe disabilities in vision, and they'll have caregivers or they'll need assistive technology, such as there's a walking sonar cane. So it's just like the walking cane that's traditional, but it has a sonar tone that allows you to kind of hear or see what's in front of you. There are also vision enhancements that are available. We actually wear glasses, and then the sound, again, sends out sonar sounds. Then it'll translate that into sort of an image, an oral image that you can see. Pretty cool technology. And there's the totally blind who are affected by the same types of benefits, but they can't see anything at all. So, and then there's hearing impairment is the next one I'm going to be discussing. There's conductive hearing loss. That's where they'll have the quality is fine. They can understand different channels of sound without a problem, but they might need slightly larger volume. This can also be an issue with cell phones and phones in general, because phones have issues with the higher frequencies and the lower frequencies as well, I believe. They just don't have enough range and frequency to fully hear everything that you need to hear, especially if you need to hear it at a certain volume. Sensory hearing loss. This again, this one can actually lead to total deafness. The other one couldn't. And with total deafness, then you have to make sure that you've got visual representations of sound. So you need things like closed captioning. Closed captioning is different than just having, say you have a spoken dialogue. It's different than just having the typed out version of the dialogue. Closed captioning means that you actually describe sounds that are within the audio file. In addition, there's, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. You can read it. It's sensorial hearing impairments, and that's the rarest kind, but that's where the quality is inefficient. So you can't actually make out the voice. You can only hear the tones. And that's where things like sonification research can be really useful, because they can still hear the basic tones, the basic tempo and stuff. They just can't make out enough of a range of sound to get useful information out of that. And then paralysis. This one encompasses a lot of diseases, and not just diseases. It includes people who are paralyzed from car accidents and stuff. This one can, unlike the other ones where something, well, actually anybody can be affected by any of them at any time due to an accident, but this is probably the most common one to get from an accident. So this is where people are temporarily abled until they fall and break their legs permanently. So, and this is also something that affects older people a lot more often due to them being more likely to fall and break their hip or something, and they get paralyzed. And technologies that can help people like this that are mobile are things like I said, the portable talking computers that talk for people. And there are also wheelchairs are technically mobile. They have wheels, you move around on them. So then there are the puff and blow systems for the wheelchairs, so that way people who are completely paralyzed other than their mouths can still move around. And then mental disability covers a wide range. I'm only briefly talking about a few of those, because these are the ones that I feel are most affected by technology. There's mental retardation, people who, for whatever reason, just don't have the same learning capabilities as the average person, I guess, if you want to refer to them that way. And they can be assisted by PDAs and stuff that can give them more readily accessible information, assuming the interface is simple enough for them to use. Also, autism can be affected by PDAs. Autistic people, they have trouble with social interaction. So there are actually technology out there right now that they can hook a small camera up to glasses and also wear a microphone, and that will then translate social cues of the people that they're talking to, and it'll tell them the mood of that person, because autistic people have issues understanding how people are feeling. And then the PDAs will also tell the autistic person the proper social reaction to that social environment. So pretty cool and rather helpful for autistic people, I think. Although that technology is still really new, so that might be an issue. Yes?
Did you say earlier in the last slide that the cause of paralysis?
Accidental, no, just most frequent accidental disability is paralysis.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Falling.
No. It's most commonly caused by diseases. But. Yeah. Then there's also attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and this is another area that's affected a lot by disabilities, both in a way that causes issues, because a lot of interfaces are really busy, and that makes it really difficult for people with attention deficit disorder to actually use them. They require really simple interfaces, such as a 4-button or 5-button iPod to actually be able to fully focus on it sometimes. That's only for the extreme cases. For the more mild cases, which we're more used to, that's not so much of an issue. And then they can also use mobile technology to help them focus by either giving them like reminders of what they're supposed to be working on or whatever else. Which also brings me to Alzheimer's disease. PDAs have been extremely useful in helping people in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, where they begin to be affected by memory loss. And there have been a lot of different research projects going on for, I think, at least the past 5 years that involve doing scheduling issues with people with Alzheimer's disease and doing other mobile things. And actually, even the iPod has a calendar feature now, so people with Alzheimer's disease can record stuff in their iPod and be reminded of what they need to be doing. So this is, that's an incorrect title, but distribution of different impairments. As you can see, most of them are fairly low percentage-wise. I mean, most people that are younger are 98.7% have no disabilities, but as we age, we have more problems. So as we're living older and older, we're probably going to end up with even more problems. So as you can see, though, 65 and over, that's 71.1%. That means over 25% have disabilities. That's a rather large number of people with disabilities. So especially when we're talking about making technology accessible to everybody, people who are older vote more, so politicians should be doing something about it. Here is the internet access distribution. As you can see, the top graph is people with no disabilities. Purple represents disabilities, purple represents computer access and internet access within the home. Yellow indicates internet access outside of the home, and blue indicates no internet access. People who have no disabilities have over 50% with internet access, but then on the low side of things, people with vision problems have about a little bit over 20%, and people with walking problems have a little bit over 18%. That's a really large divide for internet access. And even people with hearing problems, where normally when you think of like the internet, you don't think of it being so much of an auditory object. You won't normally think of it more as like a visual reading information, but even they have a really small percentage. So this clearly shows that something's terribly wrong with the amount of access.
Is this access to the hardware to get on the internet, or is this access to what's on the internet?
This is from the U.S. Census. They didn't really define what it is, but purple is internet access within the home, where they actually have a computer in their home and internet access to it. And then yellow is having internet access at a different location, whether it's work or a library.
So this could be it's that they have internet access in their home. It doesn't have to do with the accessibility.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another issue is, go ahead.
Sorry, what's the meaning of learning disability?
A learning disability is, learning disability is what I basically interpreted as mental disabilities, or people who have issues. They could have issues focusing on things. Could be, I think people who have focusing issues sometimes have to use like the switch interfaces where it's just a one-handed interface, as well as people who have problems with paralysis will need that too. Any other questions? Okay. The other thing to note on this is it's not talked about here, but people who have, it's talked about in the paper, but minorities who also have disabilities are less likely to try and use accessible technology. So then you have a double divide sort of for them if you're trying to do stuff. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about visual impairment divide. So I'm going to focus on that area because that was one of the larger gaps, and it was an area that I've done a little bit of work in, not too much. So the visually impaired individuals, like I say here, are particularly affected by the digital divide. 10 million residents, U.S. residents, are visually impaired or blind, and about 15% of them actually have access to the internet. Yes.
Does that 10 million include people who wear glasses, contacts, and are legally blind?
Not in this one, no. But it's not just the legally blind. I think this one only includes severe visual impairment, so where they can't do normal activity without this. So, okay. So I'm also going to go off of that with the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is an act that was passed in, I think it was 1990 by George Bush Sr. And it actually came with a lot of controversy because people at the time, especially corporations, felt it would cost them too much to make things accessible to everybody. And this is now being moved into the digital arena, with companies such as Target recently being sued because their website wasn't accessible by people with visual disabilities, because they had a Flash-based site, and that's not accessible because there's no text. How are they supposed to access it? So this is something to keep in mind, that if you're building interfaces that aren't accessible to other people, you're free to sue you, which is actually one of the reasons why some Republicans had issues with it. Not just Republicans, but corporations, because they felt it opened up too many lawsuits, and now people, I guess, are suing professionally. But I mean, I think overall it's a very good thing, and people should be trying to keep things accessible with or without this act.
It's not hard.
Yeah, it's not hard, especially for like visual impairment. As long as you're putting everything in text or have a text alternative, and allow this to
page.
Yeah.
That's accessible. Easy way to get to it.
Yeah, but people complain, and the web developers were complaining that they had to do it. So. Okay, and now I'm just going to briefly talk about this. I know some of you wanted further information, but due to the limitations in time, I just want to go over it briefly. So this is an example of allowing accessibility for people with paralysis or whatever. They basically implant a chip into your brain, and then they connect it to a small network of computers. So this one isn't so portable at the moment because of the computational power you need, but once computational power increases, which it always does, this should be able to fit in a small PDA eventually, probably another decade or so though. But this allows a person who can't move any of their limbs to navigate around a computer. They can access email. I think they can reply to email, and they can move cursor around the screen. So this is a good alternative for them. Okay, so I'm going to briefly review the framework that we all read. There were the four major areas: the developers, for all of you probably for the most part, or at least assisting in development, even if you're not actually doing any coding. Then there's the accessible technology experts. Those are people who are paid by the state. Iowa actually in Des Moines has an office for accessibility assistance. And Iowa State also has an office in Durham just for accessible technology. So, I mean, and it's pretty common across states and colleges to have different offices to help these people. So you don't necessarily have to hire someone professionally, which wasn't, that's my 5-minute warning. Okay, so caregivers is another area. Caregivers are people who are assisting people with disabilities. So if you're helping a parent, then that would be you. Users are, of course, the end users. We don't need to go into that too much. This is that cycle that was talked about and featured in that paper. You've all seen this, and I'm running low on time, so we're going to move on. So we're going to design an accessible iPod. So I wanted to know what disability we want to redesign the iPod for. Are there any suggestions? That would be rather difficult, but we can try it. Okay, so lack of motor movements. Does that include the inability to talk like Stephen Hawking's, or?
Let's say
okay, speech. Okay, so that makes things a little bit easier. Okay, so what are the unique challenges that need to be met? Anybody want to offer anything?
You can't get a touch interface at all.
That's true. Voice recognition. Okay, so
you have to provide an automatic way to charge it to.
I didn't even think about that, but that's a very, very good point.
It has to be surface someplace where you can see it.
Yeah, and it would also, yeah, also probably it would need to be able to withstand a drop, which I'm not completely sure the current iPods can. Drop from a decently high place, as documentation said. Like if someone's on a wheelchair or something, they're moving along, and then for whatever reason, either a glitch in the software for the wheelchair or just hit a bump, the iPod could like fall off the wheelchair and hit something. Unless it's stronger than it probably is right now, then that could be an issue. And then how will the users actually benefit from this technology? Does anybody have any suggestions other than just being able to enjoy music? You may be able to give them access, but I don't know how. Well, with voice recognition, yeah. Podcasting, yeah, that way they can get news. Yeah, news is actually, that's a good one, in lectures. So those are both really good suggestions that would probably help them a lot. That way they wouldn't have to actually travel to class all the time, which would be difficult. So customization, subgroups of this disability. I'm just going to cover this really quick. There are people who have just have no access to the leg. They're a lot easier to work with. So even though we said no touch interface, we might want to allow a touch interface for them, just because there are some people who actually do have movement in their hands. And then there are other subgroups, but again, I'm running low on time. So what options can we add to increase the greater level of comfortable accessibility? One of the things that was mentioned was that the adoption rate of accessible technology is low because sometimes it stands out. Well, the iPod is used by a rather large portion of people. So if everybody has something, if these people are using something that looks like an iPod but has greater functionality that allows them to aids them in their life, like maybe it can actually talk to, like talk to other users if they do have a disability that prevents them from talking, then that would be good because that way they're not standing out. And that way maybe even people in minorities who try to avoid technologies that make them stick out, I guess, even more.
So one of the other things they talked about in the article you mentioned was the designing for the caretakers.
Yes, and that's the other thing. Because most people have now used an iPad, or at least have seen one, they might be able to understand the interface a little bit better and be able to program it better for these people with disabilities, especially if you're talking about podcasts, they'd be able to load the podcast onto the iPod for them because they've probably used iTunes and the iPod before.
Do we design a special device for people who have disabilities, or do we add functionality to the standard device?
In most of the cases, it's better to add it to the standard device. But in some cases, like this one, because the changes to it might have to be more extreme and increase the cost for everybody, it might be better to just create a special one that's just a little bit more subsidized through government grants. But I mean, things like changing font size and stuff and adding text for visually impaired people, that's easy to do, it's cheap, that should be done across the board, just depends on the situation. So, conclusion, accessible technology adds value to the lives of the people who use it. The adoption rate is kind of low, so the important thing is to make things accessible and common. So don't be making special things unless you really have to. Just try and implement it into your standard interface so that way they don't feel like they're being like targeted or whatever. They don't feel like they're standing out too much, because people who have disabilities don't like other people knowing if they can avoid other people knowing about the disability, because they're often treated differently. So, are there any questions? No? Okay.
Let's thank our speakers. Great. Let's take a second to fill out your evaluation forms, and while Valerie has a chance to get set up.
Thank you.
Who's going to play some sound?
Our next speaker is Valerie Journey.
Almost.